thank you everyone for coming on the horrendous day. The only thing nice about this day is us. So this is the Music, Language, and Emotion Workshop. This is the first of what we hope is going to be a continuing series. Sponsored by the FOSS initiative here at Stony Brook, which is the interdisciplinary initiative in the arts, humanities, social sciences, and by 3 departments. Okay? That was music. Music, linguistics, and psychology. And here's sort of the format that we're going to try to follow. We have 6 talks over the course of the day, 3 sets of 2, and we have about 45 minutes for each slot, although we've built in sort of extra time because things like getting started late and having too much to discuss and all that kind of thing. So although the sort of expected run time of the presentation, so for the speakers, for the presentations themselves, is supposed to be 35 minutes, and I will wave at you after 30 minutes. It's not really going to be like a conference where I will then stop you. So this is a self-imposed, it has to be a time limit, unless things get really out of hand. You just won't have time for lunch if things go too long. And at the end of the day, there will be a reception. We'll be in this room for the first 2 talks and the first 2 talks after lunch. And then we will be in Lecture Hall 1 for the last 2 talks and the performance. We're closing the workshop with a musical performance. And there'll be a reception between the final talk and the performance. There'll also be a coffee break in the afternoon. So a couple of words of thanks to people who made this possible, besides the sponsors, individuals who made this possible. The biggest thanks goes to Andrew Conklin and Nicole Kalma, who did all the organizational work from music and psychology, respectively. Thank you. I would also like to point out Poppy Slocum on poster design, superb. Julia Manyakina on camera. And all of you for coming, thank you very much. And I would like to ask Susan Brennan to introduce the first speakers. Thank you.
Okay. So our first talk is going to be on how much do jazz players share understanding of their performance, a case study, and it's by Michael Schober and NETA Spiro. I'll start by introducing NETA, and then I'll introduce Michael. NETA, I'm sorry. I haven't met NETA until just now when she just got off the cab literally a second ago, and so thank you for NETA is a researcher with the Nordhoff Robbins Music Therapy organization in London. She has a BA in music from Oxford, an MSc in cognitive science and natural language from Edinburgh, and a PhD in music psychology co-supervised by Ren Spot at University of Amsterdam and Ian Cross at Cambridge. And postdocs at Royal Holloway at the University of London, University College London, and at the New School for Social Research, where I assume this collaboration took place. Michael got his Bachelor of Science at Brown in Cognitive Science and his PhD at Stanford, where he and I were trained at the same time in Herb Clark's lab. For a while, Michael was torn between pursuing a career as a concert pianist or classical pianist versus psychology, and so he went back and forth several times since I've known him. When we were in grad school, he used to put on a wonderful concert every year, which I would audio record because I had a previous career as a recording engineer for public TV. For a while he tried to teach me, bravely and unsuccessfully, I might add, piano. He was more successful in teaching me when he taught aerobics, however, but the piano didn't work. Michael's research in psychology has broken new ground in areas such as spatial perspective taking and language use, conversational approaches that have revolutionized survey research, and sometimes violently, I might add, and in interpersonal coordination in music performance. Michael wound up as a professor at the New School for Social Research with one foot in psychology and the other, appropriately enough, in the Parsons School of Design, where he's active in the music program. He's performed in many amazing venues, including Steinway Hall and Tishman Auditorium in New York and the Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA, right? No, you performed somewhere in LA.
Yeah.
I was thinking, all right, whatever, okay. I thought it was, okay. Recently, though, I've been doubting his sanity, as have many of his other close friends, because he's been serving as the dean at the New School for Social Research for the last 7 years. I'm happy to report he'll soon be stepping down, though, and will be able to return to the things that he loves more than being dean, which is pretty much everything, I think. Finally, Michael is an excellent cook and also a very messy one who will use every pot and pan in your kitchen. He's best known, perhaps, for his brain-shaped Jell-O desserts and his Sudafed chip cookies. I give you Michael Schober.
going to use the microphone or not to use it? Can you hear me if I talk like this? Okay, great. So, so thank you very much. Delighted to be here, and it's really a pleasure. And to talk about this, this beginnings of a line of research that NETA and I have been carrying out. So that's NETA over there. And really fortuitously and oddly, she is staying with me as of last night. And so the fact that she was here today is very surprising and lovely that she could be here. It's great. Okay, so when musicians collaborate, they are predicting, perceiving, and reacting to what their partners do in all sorts of complex ways. It's all sorts of music psychologists as well as people from other fields have been looking at very closely. And there's lots of questions about how it works. You could take two very extreme stances on this. An extreme individualist stance, which is that each player is following their own script, whether that's a notated or improvised script, and they happen to be playing at the same time as the other. The ensemble works because they both are following the same or close enough of a rhythmic structure, and they sort of keep together. Then you could have an extreme collaborative stance on the other end, where each player is fully aware of, tracking every gesture by the other, and initiates each of their own musical gestures as a response to the other's gestures. By definition, then, every sounding of every player's notes is a collaborative act, and intentionally so. Right? The reality has to be somewhere in between, and it probably ranges between those extremes at different moments within a pair. Right? And there is also, almost certainly, variability across musicians, and in different pieces and different playings of those pieces, and at different moments within a playing, which end of that spectrum they are on, how much they are fully keeping track of the other and adapting and coordinating, and how much they are just in their own head and happen to be playing at the same time as the other. So the territory that NETA and I are engaged in here is trying to understand more about how that works, and we've come up with a very odd way of getting at it. So here's the question for this, again, pilot study that we think will turn into something bigger over time. The question is, how much do jazz players share understanding of their performance? To what extent and in what arenas do they need to understand what they are doing in the same way? There obviously has to be at least some intersubjective agreement if musicians are going to follow a shared rhythm and create a plausible joint performance, right? There has to be something that is similar enough in how they are conceiving of things for it to work at all. But must everything be agreed upon? So here's our aim in this study, is to explore the extent to which a pair of experienced jazz musicians understand what they have done together in the same way. Whether they spontaneously generate the same descriptions of their performances and intentions in immediate retrospective accounts. And here we're inspired by Gottman and Levinson's work on married couples and the extent to which they don't necessarily understand what is going on in their interactions the same way. And Stinson's work very similarly on strangers and others, and immediate affective ratings immediately after their experiences. And for our perspective, a more interesting question, when they do not generate the same descriptions, whether they agree with their partner's characterization of what happened and what was intended. Okay? And of course, we know that such descriptions are not going to capture all that is happening. Any description is a communicative act at a particular moment in a particular interpretation, and any one account is never going to reflect everything. But it's a place to start. So our participants here were a professional saxophonist and a pianist who had never previously met. Both were male and in their 20s. Both had graduated from the same jazz conservatory, but at different times. They both regularly perform in New York City. We paid them $100 for participating in a fairly intensive set of exercises. They never saw or spoke to each other throughout the experiment, and they still have not, because we may be interviewing them some more. And we set this up with a visual barrier in the New York City performance space, exactly because we didn't want judgments about appearance, about stereotypes of anything about them to potentially be affecting what's going on. Now, obviously, this is a very strange musical situation in one respect, and people are filtering an awful lot through their judgments of the other. On the other hand, performers regularly do and have recording situations where they are working with a recording of someone that they never see as well. So it's not a completely unfamiliar thing. What's unusual is doing it live and never seeing the person you're playing with live. So on the day of the performance, we had them improvise 3 different versions of a standard. It turned out to be, it could happen to you. We had them select separately from a list of 9 tunes that we thought the performers might feel comfortable improvising with an unfamiliar partner. The tunes were selected to be, first, challenging enough to keep the interest of 2 good players through 3 interpretations. to be flexible enough to provide a range of improvisatory options, so having common alternate chord changes, not traditionally being played in a single standard key, and being common enough so that both performers would be likely to be comfortable playing them. So we had a list of tunes that range from, there's one or two that pretty much any jazz player ought to be able to do, and others that are less common. And it turns out of this, the one circled on the sheets, It Could Happen to You was the one that made sense to pick. The instruction, they entered the building completely separately, were briefed separately, came into the room from different sides, so they were sitting on either side, on either side of the musical barrier, one side that had a visual barrier, one side had the piano, one did not, and they were instructed by the experimenter in the room, but they never saw each other. Okay? And they were allowed to talk during that part. They were instructed that the performance should be different from each other. They should last about 5 minutes each with silence in between, but they cannot speak to each other at all, before, during, or after. Again, this was, I think they found it sort of fun as an interesting task to try to figure out how to manage this without talking. But obviously there's no instruction on who starts, no instruction on what key, no instruction on anything. Okay? Post-performance interviews. Immediately after, we interviewed each player separately, different interviewers in a different space, about the 3 performances. The interviewer's task was to elicit detailed and specific commentary with as many statements clearly tied to specific moments in the music as possible. First from memory, just talk about what was different about these performances and the like, and then while listening to recordings of the performances, potentially multiple times with stops and starts controlled by the performer being interviewed, and the interviews took about an hour. So the interviewers were given these prompts. For example, for the memory part, sample prompts include, how would you describe the differences in the 3 performances you 2 just gave? Were there any moments that you had trouble playing together? Did you feel that someone was in charge, and did this change during your performance? For the recordings, the prompted part, the prompts included, what do you think worked and what didn't? How did you know what to do next? What did your partner do that struck you as particularly interesting or notable? So we had a whole sheet of these, and those were visible to both the interviewer and the performer throughout. So the interviewers took about an hour each. We audio recorded them for subsequent analysis. We also got a jazz expert to provide written commentary based on close listening to the recording, so that we elicited yet more statements and claims made about what was happening in the performances. So to give you a sense of how the performances went and how different they were, and how good they were too. They were really good. Here's the first version. It's the first moment they've ever played together. Here's the second one. Very different. Sax starts this time. How did that happen? That's the most mysterious. Touch Hoping something would happen, it did not. It needs to go another round until the sax can come in. Commentary, we extracted 151 statements about the players, the performances, and their musical intentions. There were 70 statements we could extract from what the pianist has said. He talked more. 34 statements by the sax, and 64 statements by the jazz expert. 14 of the statements were alternate versions of the same claim by more than one party, and there were 4 statements that were variants that all 3 of them had made. So this led to 151 unique statements that we could extract from the audio recordings. We anonymized the statements and made them consistent so they could point to precise moments in the recording. So when one of the players said I was playing a bass part, we translated that into, and then was pointing to a particular place in the recording during that. We said at about 4:08, the sax plays a bass part. Okay. There were 30, just as a general profile of the statements, 33 statements were made about one performance, but could potentially, in principle at least, apply to any of them. The overall performance was standard or vanilla. You could make a judgment about that, about any of the 3 performances, right? There were 4 that were general statements about all the performances, like my partner's signals were very clear. And then there were 114 that could only apply to one performance, like just before about 28, the sax was waiting for the piano to play the tonic as a cue to start the melody. Okay. So, retrospective ratings, 2 months later, we had the performers listen to the recordings again, alone at home, and rate on a 5-point scale the extent to which they endorsed each of those statements. There were 4 sections to our questionnaire. First, there were these general statements about the players and performances. Then were the statements that could apply to more than one performance, which we had them rate for all 3 of the performances, and I'll show you what that looked like. Then we had the statements that were about just one performance, and then we had questions about the experience of completing the questionnaire, like did you find yourself remembering how you felt at the time, or thinking about how you feel about things now when listening, or a bit of both. Okay. So the questionnaire, because of these multiple ratings, ended up requiring 215 separate ratings of the statements about the performances. So here's what it looked like for the 3. So this performance was the most enjoyable of the 3. They have to rate between strongly, disagree, and agree. And so for listening for performance take 1, I think this was the pianist who did the rating, strongly disagreed that the first performance was the most enjoyable, agreed that the second take was the most enjoyable, and really didn't like the third take at all. Okay. And the pianist's time feel was rushed, said that was true in take 1, was not true in take 2, and was definitely true in take 3. Okay. So here's what it looked like when they were, for those statements that were just about a particular version. Here's one that was by the sax expert. At about 0:17, the piano changes the quality to Phrygian, signaling a more functional dominant. And the pianist said, I agree, but it's more around 28. At about 0:28, the piano gave the cue to lead the melody. The pianist substitutes at bar 15-16, down you tumble as with a different chord progression. And we have different sections saying, here's from about 122, these are statements, listen to this part and see to what extent you agree or don't agree with these these statements. Well, more of the same. You see, there was not uniform agreement. There were things they strongly disagreed with, right? So the pianist's opening was excellent. Strongly disagree for this take, right? This was the pianist's own self-criticism about this. The sax had said the pianist's opening was excellent, and the pianist hated it. The pianist start, the tempo is clear and steady. Agree. At the pianist start, it is hard to hear what the chord progressions are. Strongly disagree, right? So,
Which performance? What are they talking about there?
this one was. Which one is it?
It would be 3.
The third performance.
When the pianist was incredible.
Yes. So the pianist clearly thought that it was very clear what was going on and that it was terrible. Right? So, okay. Okay, so what do we see in the patterns? The first question we wanted to know was, to what extent do people agree with their own statements versus their partner statements versus the expert statements? From earlier work I'd done on participants in interaction, I would have thought that the two parties would be the ones who would have more endorsement and the outside expert would have less. That was just my naive starting assumption. And that's not what happened. What we found was, both parties agreed with 80 to 90% of what they themselves had said 2 months ago. They agreed with between 60 and 80% of what the expert said, and between 40 and 60% of what their partner said. And of course, it's only one pair. Who knows whether this is the kind of thing that would happen all over the place, but it is notable that there's a real discrepancy where they are not agreeing with their partner statements so much. So how much agreement was there? And so we've been looking at lots of different ways, and we're still not done. We're thinking it through a lot. So at one level of abstraction, there was broad agreement between the players. So if you look at those 33 statements that could apply to more than one performance, and look at the ranking of them, which of the 3 takes they ranked as most agreement, less and less. The performers agreed on the rank orderings of the 3 takes for 11 out of 33. But if you count ties, where they, and generously say that counts as, one person ranked it, performed, 2, 3, 1, and the other said 2, and then made the other 2 tie. If you count that as an agreement, then we add another 16. So that's 27 out of 33 that they have a similar ranking. Again, depending on how you think about what a tie means in this kind of rating. But if you look more closely, there are really surprising discrepancies, or ones that I find very surprising, and that's what I think is most intriguing about all of this. So out of those 217 separate ratings, players differed by 2 or more rating points, and 2, 3, or 4 rating points, which is a really big disagreement and certainly crossing the neutral point, on 62 of them, and by 3 or more on 24 of them, 11% of them. So it starts getting, so what are they most disagreeing on becomes the interesting question to us. So statements with the most disagreement included judgments of the quality of one party's performance. So the pianist's opening was excellent, for example. We saw that one before. The pianist's chord at about 123 didn't work. Both parties were highly self-critical and complained a lot about the things they themselves had done, and their partners tended to like what their partners had done. So that was pretty clear. Judgments of quality of the ensemble. This was not the best performance. They had different ideas about what had worked and what had not. Which is surprising to me, because it felt, as an outsider listening to it, that things were working, right? Assessments of the nature of the collaboration could differ. During these 2 courses, starting at about 122, the sax hears and uses the pianist's substitutions. That does not strike me as the kind of thing one would be likely to have a discrepancy about, right? Claims about intentions. Maybe that's not surprising you could have any discrepancies in claims about intentions. But at about 452, the sax intended to play another chorus. That's a big judgment about what is going on in the ensemble, about what should be coming next. And if they are disagreeing that this is where they are in the script and here was what was intended, that is surprising to me. The sax expected to have accompaniment during Fried Bananas. That's, again, a big difference in judgment about what was happening collaboratively. And then, really more surprising, were even very basic facts about what had happened could have discrepancy. So, at about 221, the sax started a phrase on B flat. You would think that they would make it, that is a kind of musicological fact that it's either true or not, right? And here it's not agreed upon. The sax gave a cue to end at about 5:58 by playing louder and in F. Now that's a complex statement, and it's not clear whether the disagreement is about whether it was a cue or not, a cue to end or not, and whether it was louder and in F. Maybe it was a cue, but they didn't think that was what the cue was. So there's lots of ambiguities here. But again, to me it is surprising that, that there can be disagreement about the kinds of statements there was disagreement on here. Of course, there's lots of questions about how to interpret this. Do they reflect true disagreement? Do they reflect different interpretation of what the same statement means? Or different interpretations of how a statement applies to a particular performance, right? So I don't want to claim that we know that we're getting at deep understanding of their intentions in all of this. But this project is raising for me all sorts of questions about musical intentions, right? So presumably performers have an initial musical or artistic intention with every single gesture they're making. At least the ones they are talking about here, a target of what they were trying to achieve. It's not random. At each moment they're trying to do something. And whether that's a truly individual act or a truly joint act, is the ambiguity. And that target can be unfolding, and it can continue to change moment by moment depending on what was actually produced thus far. So if you think of like watercolorists and how they paint, they may have an intention of what they want to put down, but then the paint does what it was going to do on that paper and goes in a different direction, and then the watercolorist's job is to make use of that and do something with it. I think that's very much like what's going on here with the improvisation, is both on your part, where you start doing something, and depending on what you did before, that constrains the structure of what could come next, whether it was what you intended or not, and you must adjust your intention accordingly. But there's also what your partner's doing the whole way through that is continually adjusting and changing what you were doing, and that must be adjusted along the way. I think players may or may not be aware of, either at the time or in retrospect, or able to articulate in words the details of these fleeting and emerging musical intentions. And so this task is sort of trying to force something on it that makes it's very hard, ineffable stuff to get at. But it raises for me questions about how much of a monitor of a partner do you really have? So player B, hearing what player A has done, really only has the surface of what A produces to go on in judging A's musical intentions, right? Plus filtered through all of their prior knowledge about the genre and about their guesses about who this player is and what that person is likely to do, etc. There has to be some sort of ongoing partner monitor, or else B would always assume that A's bloopers or missteps were fully intended, and they don't. And you can tell, when you're playing with somebody whether they can't have meant to do that. So at some level, there's got to be a monitor going on, not unlike a linguistic monitor that happens. But how elaborate and full-fledged this monitor is unknown, and how it waxes or wanes, or how it depends on familiarity with the partner in piece is also unknown, and I have not yet seen a literature that sort of outlines how to think about this. It's a complex thing. Maybe some of the linguistic interaction literature is relevant in here, but whether those prosodic and timing and other cues are exactly the same in music or not is a real question for me. But I think even tentatively we can say, just with this case study, that we have a few conclusions we can already make. So first, the high quality of these performances combined with the disparities in agreement that we're seeing suggest that, at least in this case study, fully shared understanding of what happened is not essential for successful improvisation. I judge those improvisations as having been successful and good. There is surprising disagreement to me. And the fact that the performers endorsed an expert listener statements more than at least some of their partners suggests to me that the performers' interpretations may not be privileged relative to an outsider's, at least in some aspects. And again, that is surprising to me from a linguistic interaction perspective. So the next steps of what we're doing with this are to get judgments of these statements by a virtual audience. So we will be releasing these statements on the internet and getting ratings by people who are trained musicians, untrained musicians, people who know jazz and love jazz versus don't, people who play the sax versus play the piano. Will there be differences in endorsement and hearing depending on what their people's prior background is? Will there be more or less agreement with the performers than the performers have with each other? And will different sub-parts of a virtual audience have more or less similar hearings to the different players? We don't know. Same patterns in more pairs of performers. This is only one pair. We don't know whether that's going to generalize to other situations, although I can't say, having now labored over these interviews and statements, that we are quite as eager as we started out to be to get a massive sample of pairs of people to do this with. But it's a thing we could do. And And it immediately raises all sorts of questions about different genres, right? So, and when you're following a notated score versus not, and if you have different pairings of people. I mean, it was actually just, even for this pilot, a real question in wrangling our participants. To what extent should we be getting people that we think already are likely to have maximal difference or not? And this is, if not knowable, predictable. So in the New York jazz community, which is what we were sampling from, you know, the person who was helping us was saying, well, do you want people who we know have different training, come from different generations, different schools, and do we want that to be the story? Or do you want people who have really similar backgrounds? And you're studying something very different if you get those two things. And so for this first take, we did the weird visual barrier thing as a way of hoping to sort of get around some of that background stuff. But of course you can't get around that background stuff at some level. We're pretty sure that if we had chosen people, you know, somebody who's 60 and has been playing and was trained in Philadelphia versus somebody who's 20 and has been playing recently with a different thing, that they will be sussing each other's playing out very quickly, making all sorts of inferences about where this person comes from. I mean, they're certainly making judgments about quality of the playing, the reactivity, the extent to which the other is sensitive, but they will also have massive inferences very quickly about background knowledge store and what is expectable based on that. So one could study that, but it's going to be a lot of work to get there. So I guess I'll stop with that.
Did you ask them about each other at the end? Like,
we did. We asked them, do you know who it was?
Yeah.
What do you think about what they were? They, both of them did not know. One of them had a guess that was wrong, but was very unsure about it also.
in terms of the identity.
About the identity of who it was. They both rated the other as a truly wonderful musician and wanted to be able to play with them again, which was nice. So, so at some point we will have to tell them who the other is, but we still, if we want to go back to them again, we need to not tell them quite yet. But
yeah, and one of them was trying to guess through the interview. It was something that was bugging him.
yeah.
You guess now.
Yeah. Although I think that's part of what made it sort of intriguing for them also. It had this extra sort of puzzle game going on.
But no, it's similar. I mean, did they know, because you said, you know, you didn't want to take someone from Philadelphia who was different, so did they know that they were of the same, they didn't know anything?
We didn't know anything, they didn't know
So they
gender,
could've-
they didn't know age, they didn't know anything, they were a visual barrier, and you just didn't know.
I see.
And that was on purpose. But
Yeah.
again, in a way that's an extremely artificial thing to do, because anytime musicians are encountering each other, there's a million judgments they're making based on appearance and how they play and knowledge about background and reputation and all that stuff. So it is odd of us to try to take it away. On the other hand, putting it in suddenly turns it into a very different kind of study by necessity.
Were they both men?
They were both men. Which, you know, that by base rates in the New York City jazz scene, that would be about right. So they would, if they had to guess, they would probably guess male because based on just who's out there. But yes, yeah.
So if you take out the value judgments of your set of answers,
Yes.
right? So you take out all of the pianist instincts
Yeah.
stuff, right? How much does the agreement rise? So if you're just focusing on practical and musicological comments.
So our first take through the statements was to try to get a coding scheme that would look at exactly that, like what are factual and musicological and metaphoric statements of various sorts, what are claims about intentions, what are claims about beliefs, what are claims about quality of performances and players. And the trouble was we found statements of discrepancy in every single one of our categories. And
There was a slide that sort of implied that particularly common discrepancies were in the value judgments. So I was imagining that,
Right.
that the disagreement might not have been so great if you managed to take out those.
Yeah, we thought that's what we thought at first as well, and then so we started thinking that it was going to be the value judgments and the claims about intentions in particular that were going to be the discrepancies, and the claims about fact were going to be the ones that would be the same. There were more statements of fact than the others, but percentage-wise, we're not seeing a difference. There are strong disagreements among things that we would have thought were basic facts. So but we don't have an idea for why these facts and not those, right? But maybe we'll get there, but we're not there yet. Yeah.
Trying to put it in more of a realistic context, do you think if you had repeated recordings that these discrepancies might decrease?
It's a really good question, and you wonder whether people who've played together for years, whether they will have much, much more similar interpretation of what's going on. Although if you look at Levinson and Gottman and Ickes and Stinson in totally other domains, it's not that people who've been together for years necessarily have the same understanding of what just happened in other interactions. So there's no guarantee of that. And you do wonder whether, in the same sort of Levinson and Gottman way, whether partners who have more disagreement are less likely to stick together, which is exactly what happens in the Levinson and Gottman place. Is more shared interpretation needed, or could you just live with, as long as you don't talk about it too much, live with different interpretations as long as you're making good music together that both of you are pleased with, independent of whether you would characterize it as the same thing? Maybe.
Yeah, I guess this kind of relates to the last point as well. How much of what you think you're doing is what is going on between the two of you, and how much the second person realizes what you're doing. So if you would take two people who knew they came from, say, different traditions or different areas or whatever, and you still had the screen, and all they knew was that they were from different traditions, then you might expect that the piano player might be playing, say, certain inversions or whatever, to sort of poke the other guy, to provoke him to do something that he might recognize, so that he could then adapt to that. There might be different kinds of exploration and accommodation across the barrier.
Yes, I think that
you'd find
that happens even whether one knows the tradition or not. I think there's nothing. There's a whole bunch of offering going on, trying something out and seeing whether it sticks or not. And I know these performers are trained and have a whole career worth of trying to have what in the sort of improvisatory acting world is called a yes and attitude towards things, not a no but a yes and. So your partner does something that's not what you expected, and you seize it and build on it, and they're working really hard to have that attitude as opposed to the negative judgment, and which may be some of where they're just rejecting the negative self-criticisms by the other just because of training. Although it seemed to me more as if there may almost be sort of actor-observer difference in all of this, where people feel that their own actions loom very large and are highly causal, while the others don't see them as quite so causal or so distinctive. So if when the pianist says, "I played this chord and it really screwed everything up afterwards," the sax may have thought, "Let's screw everything up afterwards. It changed the course of it," but that's not the same as ruining it. And it certainly wasn't the sole cause, because I contributed to it too. So, so in the same way as married couples all believe they do more of the chores than the other, because they're not seeing the other. It could be something like that you see and you remember what your own intentions were, but you don't remember and you didn't see the details of what the other thought they wanted to do. You only saw the surface of it. So I think there's an actor-observer story too. Yeah. Carol.
Well, back to this Levinson and Gottman, I think that's a really great comparison. And I don't know this very well, but one of the results I think they found is that happy couples, I mean, these are people who've been married for 30 years, right?
Yeah.
You'd think one person gets upset and the other person would say, "Oh, it's not so bad." But in fact, the happy couples, they both get mad at the same time, right? And so you talked about how this waxes and wanes, whatever it is, complexity or information content or something, it waxes and wanes. So it makes me think in a follow-up study, you might have people actually make online real-time judgments of each of the performers, how well they're communicating with each other, or how much they're synchronized in their ideas or something like that.
Yeah.
And that might actually get closer to something about how good they think the performance might be.
Yeah.
Yeah. People who synchronize with each other, just tapping together, like each other more.
Right. Right. And I think, again, I'd be really curious as to whether the performers themselves have different ideas of this than an outside observer. I think that there are huge questions in all of this. And in an interesting way, I thought this was this technique was sort of a takeoff, or inspired by my first studies on how addressees and eavesdroppers understand differently in interaction, and was sort of thought that the performers would have a different shared take than an outsider. But only later did I realize, well, this wasn't the same study at all, because my language studies were looking at the content of what was said. I did not have people listen to the recordings immediately afterwards and talk about what did you think your partner really meant? What else was going on in there, and why when that offer was made, was that a success or was that a failure? And it could be that even in that language situation, if you get people afterwards to make this kind of judgment, there will be far more discrepancy even though they successfully communicated. So the analogy might be here, successful playing, but not the same retrospective or external judgment on what actually happened during that interaction. Who to go to?
Do you have any intuition about how long it would take somebody to realize that they're not actually playing with somebody else, but with a recording, right? Since they can't see the person anyway, right? Right. At what point is sort of a Turing test, right? For
Yeah.
right? So that was one thing, and I was wondering if you thought of sort of selectively turning off the input for one versus the other, so you could sort of manipulate when the other's getting information from one another, right?
Delay very sorry. So I mean, there's a different study that's working on the write-up now that in which this was 30 pairs of pianists and saxophonists working together face-to-face versus via remote video versus via remote audio. And we have comparisons and measures of coordination in that begin to get at some of those delay issues. But we didn't manipulate delay in that. Though delay will just mess things up because this is so time-locked that it's obvious that it's going to be a problem. But for your...
The first one is, at what point does someone realize that there's not someone actually responding to what they're doing, right?
Well,
they're just doing their own thing? Because that can also happen, I imagine,
right.
to some extent, even when they can hear you.
Well, I mean, I think there's just in principle a big difference between true reciprocal, mutual, two-way coordination versus playing with a recording that will not adapt to you. But how quickly one figures out whether it's really a recording as opposed to someone on the autism spectrum who is not adapted to you. I don't know. And that would be or how much you sort of decide, so if you have a partner who is deeply responsive and doesn't adapt, I think many musicians will very quickly judge, oh, I have a partner who's just not very good, and they're limited in a certain way. Like they just don't have the capacity to adapt, and my job is going to have to be to adapt to them. There's no solution but to do that. And whether they would at the end judge it's a recording or a really lousy collaborator is unclear.
It's just so complex. It'd just be cool if there was a way to manipulate, introduce asymmetries, right, in some way to figure out, right?
Well, I think
how people do
I think it's a natural experiment that happens all the time. Is those asymmetries? Like you get paired with someone to play, and you have split second. Like you figure out as soon as you start, is this someone who is going to play well with me or not? So this was where these two partners were thrilled with each other because the little offers they gave got taken up in really wonderful ways. It just got better and better, and that was great. But they all musicians, like particularly in this world where you continually get paired with all sorts of others, are spending a lot of time making all these judgments about the capacities of who they're playing with. And you've got to make them fast. And if you're lucky and the person at least has a sufficient rhythmic sense, you can get through it. If they don't have a right rhythmic sense, now you're going to be in big trouble. But as far as I can tell from my informal, at least talking with the players in this world, there is, and from my own experience as a collaborative musician as well, it's very, very fast judgments have to be made. You have no option but to make them in real time, very, very quickly. And it might be that you try out a little thing and see, and if you come from different enough cultures, you may not even recognize the offers that are being made that you're not picking up on. They're making them judge you as not being up to what is needed in the current
Exactly.
moment.
So I think the bottom line was just like, so is there a way you can manipulate this, right? Or to figure out how to do it?
Yeah, cool. It's a nice idea. Yeah.
Elaine Chu, who was at USC for a long time, did an experiment. There's this interest in performance at a distance over the internet, right? And so she had that situation. She introduced a little delay.
Yeah.
And it had a big effect on how well they thought the other person was playing.
Yeah, it makes the other feel non-responsive, not subtle, right? not up to it.
So this suggests that the timing is really important. But I wonder, this is a little bit of an aside, but it sounds like you have some data that might speak to it. How much other kinds of information are useful or not, right? Like right now you've got the situation where really you've just got auditory information. And clearly that's enough to do quite successfully, but do you think anything's added by visual co-presence, by being able to see what the person's doing and how they're reacting?
Those are the data I do have, right? For the other study I'm not talking about, this is with Michelle Levine, who's now at Barnard. with these pairs. And so the general overview story, looking at measures of synchrony, measures of quality and coherence of the solos. So it was a piece that has both notated and improvised sections. And so with the notated parts, we could sample moments of synchrony. And and we sampled moments that were within an ongoing rhythm, and then a moment where you had to come in out of nowhere and hit something together. And it turns out that when you're in an ongoing rhythm, we see no difference in synchrony for face-to-face versus video versus audio only across the pairs. For the coming in out of nowhere, you do need to see each other. It's much worse in audio, but there's no difference between video and face-to-face. It's about seeing, it's not about breathing the same air. And but for the quality and coherence of the sax ratings, the ratings of the sax solo, that is a really to me interesting and surprising pattern, which is that we have blind judges who do this, as jurors all the time. Listen to these recordings, they did not know that some were face-to-face, some were audio only, some were video, and just have them rate the quality of the sax solos. Highest ratings for audio only, less good for video, least good for face-to-face. Which you can come up with the just so story afterwards that makes sense of that. The sax usually stands in front and does not have to see the people behind them, and so they aren't used to having visual distraction. The sax solo is an extremely complex task, and composing and improvising with your partner at the same time is complicated, and like various other kinds of things, visual distraction can hurt. There's a story we can make up for that, but I don't know that I would have predicted it necessarily.
This was interesting to me from the sense of a consumer standpoint, because, as music became digitized and you have jazz reissued on CD or MP3, very often with the iconic version of the standard, you get the alternate takes, which usually are surprising to somebody who's listening to it, because you're like, well, why? One thing you don't get in a lot of the information that comes with the recording is why they chose one version over another, even whether it's from a musician standpoint or the producer standpoint. And I actually kind of thought, if you had additional takes, I was like, it would be interesting to have more than 3 takes, to take the high points of the performance and edit them together, much like Tia Massaro would have done with Miles, and then see what the musicians thought of the high points all put together as a performance, right? Because then, it would just be, if they all rated those things highly, how does it all hang together?
Right. We did not have them rating the quality and success of those takes 2 months later. It's not, we were asking them to make judgments about agreeing or disagreeing with these statements about them. That would be a whole other way to go. One could see to what extent that remains over time. And we didn't control, because they were doing this at home alone, just how often they listened. They both reported that it took them about an hour to fill out the questionnaires and listen and all of that, which is about what we had guessed. So it means they definitely were listening and thinking again, and they were both clearly extremely curious about what they had done 2 months ago and to hear it again. So I think they took it very seriously and very thoughtfully, but it would be a different task to have them now do another account of now how different are your statements about what happened compared to what you thought 2 months ago.
Before they did each take, did you give them any time to practice or warm up or try something out before they started up together? So they just started cold and you said, okay, now do a second take, go.
Yep. We told them there had to be silence in between. We needed to be able to know where one started and the other stopped, and so we wanted to have them have some coherence as a performance. Right?
So for that very first take, basically, they sat down with their instruments and you said, okay,
go.
Somebody start.
We were very careful not to, we tried to be as non-directive as possible about, now it's time to start, not who should start or anything like that. Yeah. But we just said go. And you can, after you listen to the beginning of the opening of that one, the pianist starts, because that's a familiar thing for pianists to do.
Yes.
It's interesting. Take 1, the pianist started. Take 2, the sax started. Take 3, the pianist started again.
The second one, sax.
And it is a really question. It's like, how do you start? What key do you pick? And that sort of thing. But hearing that opening with those chords, it was a very smart way to go. Like it's doing a sort of dominant chord thing, hoping to see how long it goes and letting the other feel things out and sort of begin to get a feel for it. And then there's a moment where the pianist sort of says, okay, and here we go, here's the tonic, and here we go. So it was a clever way to go. We selected people that we knew were really good. and that would have some. But you can imagine lots of people would be stymied by this and would have a terrible time, and it would not go well.
Were all the takes roughly the same time?
We asked them to be about 5 minutes each, and it was truly random. This was all very exploratory. We just thought if they played 20-minute takes, which we could easily, if they would have done, they would have gone on forever, that we will have way too much material for an interview and for ever dealing with this. And in fact, once we started the interviews, it became clear that one could really probe endlessly on this and get them to go deeper and deeper into it. And there's, even 5 minutes of 3 takes with an awful lot. So.
Yeah, apart from the issue of perhaps false modesty, when this movement will start getting it's better than he was, I think it wouldn't be surprising that there would be discrepant accounts of the success of carrying out an intention. I mean, if the piano sets up a certain harmonic structure, there's lots of intelligible responses that would work. So the pianist would think that whatever the saxophone did, there was an intelligible response was well done. Whereas the saxophonist may have intended something that wasn't quite what he did, and I would think, I didn't do so. So it wouldn't be surprising if you have that kind of discrepancy, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly because you have access to your own intentions in a way that you do not have access to the others, and so you can tell when you have violated what you were hoping for. Yeah, that's exactly right.
But what about when you were hoping the other person would do it? That third one was really interesting because it sounded like the piano was kind of setting up more than once for the saxophone to come in.
Yes.
But then he didn't.
Yes. So, well, interestingly, so the pianist sort of thought that he had screwed up in that he had not set it up clearly enough, that the rhythm was fragmented enough that the saxophone couldn't even tell that it was time to come in. So there's the big cue to come in and then nothing happened. And the pianist took the blame for that. The sax felt that he had screwed up in that there was a very clear signal, it was very clear what should have happened, and he wasn't ready. And he should have. So they were both taking responsibility for the failure right there, and it again raises all those questions about how do you think about responsibility in a joint act that is creative in this way.
And if you were able to somehow rate people's self-confidence levels before pairing them together and see, like for example, if you had these people, I guess if they felt like they didn't have very high self-confidence because they seemed to be doing themselves, much more than they
Or they were so secure that they were willing to take the responsibility, right? That's they knew they're good and they have very high standards and they are regularly trying to match some standard that they're not. I'm not sure whether that's how it's glass half full, glass half empty on confidence there.
So, do you think you could get it? I'll just start. Do you think you could maybe get at this a little bit by having your expert rater do evaluations of all of the statements? Because that might give you
that's our next step, exactly. The expert rater will be curious about that. Other experts will be interesting, and I really am, and to me it starts to get into a question about the extent to which audiences have a shared understanding of what's happening. So this is the beginnings of a method for trying to get at that too.
Audience design. So, when you mentioned your over here experiment, I've been thinking about the differences between language and turn-taking and collaboration and coordination and this. And we may not have time for this discussion now, so maybe we'll do this in the coffee break later.
Yeah.
But I just keep thinking of the differences and similarities. So obviously performance is for another audience, whereas when I'm conversing with you, I'm not conversing for another audience. So there's that.
Yeah.
Turn-taking is different in that you this is not a conversation. Well, it kind of, but then also turn-taking is different. So we may, if we're not from New York, try not to overlap each other, whereas here we're trying to overlap each other, presumably,
Yes.
or we're trying to do something
Synchronize.
together. There are a lot of things that are different. So I like very much the invitation and response thing. I'm not as good at hearing that as I am in language, in speaking. But with speaking, I can hedge things, so I can show my commitment to the proposal I've made, and you can detect that commitment to the proposal I've made. Can you do that in here? So I just keep thinking, everything I think about with language and coordination, is there an analog here, or are they quite different? But we can talk about that later.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I've never seen a taxonomy that really tries to work out the different pieces and aligns them, the ones that there is. So for me, my initial intuition about the hedging thing is, yes, you can tell when you have a partner who's trying something out that they're not fully committed to.
And do
But
they
it makes
expect
it,
you to recognize
but
that?
no, but if they are not committed to it, you are much less likely to take it up in a way. Like you need them, like if you really want there to be a chance of uptake, you gotta commit to it, and then your partner will recognize they really mean to do this. If they try a little thing that isn't so great, in hopes that you might pick up on it.
Yeah. What about repair? Self-repair and other repair?
Well, repair is complicated here because of the time keeps moving, right? And so you can't backtrack and restart in this, in a way that's going to be effective if you're performing. Like in a rehearsal, you can and say, no, let's start that again. But if you're performing, time keeps marching on and you are stuck. So in a sense, you can repair if you are doing more cycles, like of the chorus or of a verse or something that keeps happening. You can do another try, another try, another try. Although if you're also simultaneously trying to create something that is a coherent performance that builds in the right way, then simply revisiting and trying again is also not a good idea. Like it's more like whatever mess was made, we need to go with that,
And that's
we need to
because
take
there's
that
a lot of-
as.
Right, possible.
Or it's because of the genre and because of the demands of doing it. So like you wouldn't. Again, it depends on if you are jointly trying to create this structure of something that works, that someone could listen to as a recording later, then it seems like any mess that was made needs to be part of what you build on, and then you even act as if it were intended in retrospect, in order to make it work. Not too long. Thank you.
So far, this is actually satisfying my dream of a conference where nobody stops the discussion. It comes to a natural conclusion, which is never the case. But so far, so good. I believe, I also wanted to, we didn't